When Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos received the frantic 911 call at 3:47 a.m. on that cold October morning, she never expected to witness something that would challenge everything she knew about law enforcement, community bonds, and the unbreakable spirit of rural America. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Jake Morrison, a weathered cattle rancher from Sweetwater County, Wyoming, and his words would echo through the small town for years to come. "I need every available unit at Miller's Ridge Road, mile marker 23, Jake's voice cracked through the static. "And I need them fast. There's been an accident, and I'm about to do something that's going to get me arrested, but I don't care anymore." What happened next would become the most talked about incident in Sweetwater County's 150-year history. It was a story that started with a simple rancher's plea for help but transformed into something much bigger, a testament to human compassion that transcended rules, regulations, and the very foundations of how communities function when faced with impossible choices. The incident would force an entire county to examine what really matters when seconds mean the difference between life and death, and when following protocol could mean losing everything that makes us human. Jake Morrison's actions that night didn't just shock the law enforcement community, they sparked a movement that would change emergency response protocols across 3 states and remind everyone that sometimes, breaking the rules is the most moral thing you can do. This is the true story of how one rancher's desperate decision became a beacon of hope for rural communities everywhere, and why his criminal act of defiance became the reason hundreds of families still have their loved ones today. Jake Morrison had been running cattle on the same stretch of Wyoming grassland for 32 years, and in all that time, he had never once questioned the rhythm of his life. Every morning at 5 a.m. sharp, he would pull on his worn leather boots, grab his coffee mug with the faded ranch logo, and head out to check on his herd. His wife Sarah would already be in the kitchen, packing lunch for their son Tommy, who was now 16 and more interested in football than cattle. It was a simple life, predictable and honest, exactly the way Jake liked it. The Morrison Ranch sat on 8,000 acres of rolling hills about 23 miles outside the small town of Cedar Valley, Wyoming. Population 2,847 on a good day when everyone was home from college or work in the bigger cities. Jake's nearest neighbor, old Pete Hendricks, lived 4 miles down the dirt road that everyone called Miller's Ridge Road, though nobody could remember who Miller was or why the ridge bore his name. The road was narrow, winding, and notorious for being treacherous in bad weather, but it was the only way in and out of the valley where 3 ranching families had made their homes for generations. Jake's father had bought the land in 1962, back when cattle prices were good and the American dream still seemed within reach for anyone willing to work hard enough. Jake had grown up learning every inch of the property, from the creek that ran dry in August to the old barn that housed their equipment and served as a shelter during the fierce Wyoming winters. He knew which pastures provided the best grazing, which fences needed constant repair, and exactly how many head of cattle the land could sustain without overgrazing. Sarah Morrison had grown up in town, the daughter of the local bank president, but she had fallen in love with Jake's quiet determination and the peaceful life he offered. They had married young, built their house where Jake's childhood home had stood, and settled into the kind of marriage that rural communities were built on. Sarah handled the books for the ranch, managed their small garden, and volunteered at the local school 3 days a week. She was the kind of woman who could birth a calf, balance a checkbook, and organize a church fundraiser all in the same afternoon. Their son Tommy was everything they had hoped for in a child, though he was reaching that age where ranch life felt more like a burden than a blessing. He dreamed of college, maybe studying engineering or business, anything that would take him beyond the fence lines that had defined his entire world. Jake understood this restlessness, having felt it himself at 16, but he also knew that the land had a way of calling people back when they were ready to listen. The Morrison family was well respected in Cedar Valley, the kind of people who showed up when neighbors needed help and never expected anything in return. Jake served on the volunteer fire department, had been a member of the school board for 6 years, and could always be counted on to donate cattle for the annual fundraising barbecue. Sarah organized the Christmas toy drive every year and had never missed a church service in the 15 years since they had joined First Baptist of Cedar Valley. It was this reputation, this deep network of relationships and trust, that would make what happened on that October night so much more significant than anyone could have predicted. Jake Morrison was not the kind of man who broke rules or challenged authority. He paid his taxes on time, followed regulations about cattle inspections, and had never received so much as a speeding ticket in his entire life. He believed in order, in systems, and in the idea that society functioned best when everyone played by the same rules. But October had been an unusually brutal month. An early snowstorm had caught everyone off guard, followed by a week of temperatures that dropped below freezing every night. Jake had lost 12 head of cattle to the weather, and the stress of moving the remaining herd to winter pastures had taken its toll on the entire family. Tommy had been helping more than usual, missing football practice to repair fences and haul feed, while Sarah had been working extra hours to file the insurance claims and manage the financial strain. The isolation that had always been one of the benefits of ranch life was starting to feel more oppressive. During the winter months, especially after a storm, Miller's Ridge Road became nearly impassable. The county road crew prioritized the main highways, which meant that sometimes Jake and his neighbors could be cut off from town for days at a time. They had learned to be self-sufficient, to stock up on supplies before the weather turned, and to handle most emergencies themselves. On the evening of October 23, Jake was finishing his final check of the cattle when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the mud near the south gate, tracks that didn't belong to any vehicle he recognized. Living so far from town, any unfamiliar vehicle was cause for concern, but these tracks suggested someone had been driving fast, too fast for the narrow dirt road that led deeper into the valley. Jake followed the tracks for about half a mile before he found what he was dreading. A small sedan had missed the curve near Deadman's Creek and plowed straight into the old oak tree that had been marking that dangerous turn for as long as anyone could remember. The car was crumpled against the massive trunk, steam rising from the engine, and Jake could see that the driver's side was completely crushed. He ran to the vehicle, his heart pounding, and discovered a young woman trapped inside. She was unconscious, bleeding from a head wound, and her breathing was shallow and irregular. Jake could see immediately that she was in critical condition, the kind of situation where minutes could mean the difference between life and death. He tried the doors, but they were jammed shut from the impact. The windows were spider-webbed with cracks, but intact. Jake pulled out his cell phone, knowing even as he dialed that he was probably outside the coverage area. The display showed no signal, exactly what he had expected. Miller's Ridge Road was in a dead zone, a fact that had never bothered him until this moment. He ran back to his truck and tried the radio, but got only static. The nearest house with a landline was his own, still 3 miles away, and he knew that by the time he could get there and call for help, it might be too late. Standing there in the growing darkness, looking at the broken car and the injured woman inside, Jake Morrison faced the kind of impossible choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Every instinct told him to race home and call 911, to let the professionals handle the situation the way they were trained to do. But his experience told him that the woman didn't have that kind of time. He had seen enough accidents over the years to recognize the signs of serious internal bleeding, and he could tell from the way she was breathing that she was in shock. Even if he could reach the emergency services immediately, the nearest ambulance was stationed 35 miles away in the county seat, and getting to this location on Miller's Ridge Road would take them at least 45 minutes under good conditions. With the road still slick from the recent snow, it could take over an hour. Jake made a decision that would change everything. He went back to his truck and retrieved the tire iron from his toolkit. He had helped with enough cattle accidents to know how to break a window safely, and he had basic first aid training from his volunteer fire department work. If he could get the woman out of the car and stabilize her condition, he might be able to transport her himself to a location where he could get cell phone coverage and call for proper medical help. Breaking the passenger side window, Jake carefully cleared away the glass and managed to reach the woman's wrist to check her pulse. It was weak and rapid, confirming his suspicion that she was going into shock. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and he could see that her lips were turning blue. There was no time left for hesitation. Working as carefully as he could in the fading light, Jake managed to unlock the car doors from the inside. The driver's side was too damaged to open, but he was able to get the passenger door partially open. Moving someone with potential spinal injuries was dangerous, he knew, but leaving her in the car was certain death. He would have to take the risk. It took him nearly 20 minutes to carefully extract the woman from the wreckage, using his jacket to immobilize her head and neck as much as possible. She was young, probably in her early 20s, wearing clothes that suggested she was from out of town, maybe even from out of state. Jake didn't recognize her, which meant she was likely just passing through, perhaps taking Miller's Ridge Road as a shortcut to the highway. Once he had her safely out of the car, Jake faced his next impossible decision. His truck was equipped with a bench seat, which would allow him to lay her down for transport, but the ride to get cell phone coverage would be rough and potentially dangerous for someone in her condition. The alternative was to leave her here while he went for help, but he was certain she wouldn't survive that long. Jake Morrison, the man who had never broken a rule in his life, made the decision to transport an injured person without waiting for professional medical help, knowing that this choice could be seen as reckless endangerment if something went wrong. But, as he looked at the young woman's pale face and listened to her labored breathing, he knew that following protocol would mean watching her die. He carefully placed her in his truck, using blankets from his emergency kit to keep her warm and to provide as much cushioning as possible. Then, he began the most terrifying drive of his life, racing against time on a road that had never been designed for speed, carrying a stranger's life in his hands, and knowing that his decision to act outside the system would soon bring consequences he had never imagined. The irony was not lost on Jake that in trying to save a life, he might be destroying his own. But, as he navigated the treacherous curves of Miller's Ridge Road, feeling the weight of responsibility for another human being, he knew that some choices transcend rules, and some actions are right regardless of their legality. What he didn't know was that this night would become the catalyst for changes that would ripple far beyond the borders of his small Wyoming county, and that his criminal act of compassion would ultimately save hundreds of lives. The drive down Miller's Ridge Road felt like the longest 20 minutes of Jake Morrison's life. Every bump in the dirt road sent a jolt of fear through him as he worried about further injuring the unconscious woman lying across his truck's bench seat. Her breathing had become even more shallow, and, despite the blankets he had wrapped around her, she felt cold to the touch. Jake found himself talking to her, even though she couldn't hear him, telling her to hang on, that help was coming, that everything would be okay. But Jake wasn't sure everything would be okay. As he drove, his mind raced through all the ways this situation could go wrong. If she died during transport, would he be held responsible? If his movement had caused additional spinal injuries, would he face criminal charges? He had acted on instinct and experience, but he wasn't a doctor or a paramedic. He was just a rancher who couldn't stand by and watch someone die. The woman stirred briefly as they hit a particularly rough patch of road, and Jake caught a glimpse of her eyes opening. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak whisper that he couldn't understand over the sound of the truck engine and the gravel under the tires. Jake reached over to touch her hand, trying to provide some reassurance. "You're going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "I'm getting you to help. Just hold on a little longer." She squeezed his hand weakly before losing consciousness again, and that small gesture gave Jake the determination he needed to push through his doubts. This wasn't about rules or protocols anymore. This was about one human being trying to save another, and Jake was going to see it through no matter what the consequences might be. When he finally reached the junction where Miller's Ridge Road met Highway 287, Jake's phone immediately started beeping with missed calls and messages. But he didn't have time to check them. He could see the lights of Cedar Valley in the distance, still 15 miles away, but, more importantly, he now had cell phone coverage. He pulled over at the junction and called 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Jake Morrison. I've got a seriously injured woman in my truck. She was in a car accident on Miller's Ridge Road, and I transported her to Highway 287 because there was no cell coverage at the accident site. I need an ambulance immediately. Sir, did you say you transported an injured person yourself? Yes, she was dying. There wasn't time to wait for help. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Jake could almost hear the dispatcher trying to process what he had told her. Moving an injured person without proper medical training was against every emergency protocol, and Jake was essentially confessing to a serious violation. Sir, I need you to stay exactly where you are. I'm dispatching an ambulance and law enforcement to your location. Do not move the victim again. I understand. But, please hurry. She's in bad shape. While they waited for the ambulance, Jake did everything he could to keep the woman stable. He checked her pulse regularly, monitored her breathing, and tried to keep her warm. The cold October air was making her condition worse, and Jake found himself second-guessing every decision he had made. Maybe he should have left her in the car and raced home to call for help. Maybe his attempts to move her had caused more damage than the accident itself. But then, he remembered how weak her pulse had been when he first found her, how blue her lips had looked in the fading light, and he knew that leaving her would have been a death sentence. Whatever consequences he faced for his actions, at least she was still alive. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes after his call, followed closely by a sheriff's deputy that Jake recognized as Maria Santos, a young woman who had graduated from Cedar Valley High School a few years behind his son Tommy. Maria had always been smart and determined, the kind of person who earned respect through competence rather than authority. The paramedics immediately took over, and Jake stepped back to watch them work. They were professional and efficient, quickly assessing the woman's condition and preparing her for transport to the regional medical center. One of the paramedics, an older man named Robert Chen, looked up at Jake with a mixture of surprise and grudging admiration. "You did good work stabilizing her," Chen said quietly. "Her vitals are weak, but she's alive. If you had left her at the accident scene, she would have died before we could have reached her." Deputy Santos approached Jake while the paramedics continued their work. She had her notebook out, but her expression was troubled rather than accusatory. "Jake, I need to understand what happened here. You transported an injured person without waiting for emergency services?" Jake nodded. "I found her trapped in her car about 3 miles up Miller's Ridge Road. She was unconscious and going into shock. There's no cell coverage up there, and I knew she didn't have time for me to drive home and call for help. You know I have to write this up. Transporting an injured person without proper medical training is considered reckless endangerment, even if your intentions were good." Jake had expected this, but hearing it stated so bluntly still felt like a punch to the gut. "I understand. But, Maria, if you had seen her condition, if you had been in my position, what would you have done?" Deputy Santos didn't answer immediately. She looked at the ambulance where the paramedics were loading the young woman onto a gurney, then back at Jake. "I would have followed protocol and called for help. And she would have died. Maybe. But that's not our decision to make. We have protocols for a reason, Jake. When civilians try to play hero, people get hurt." The ambulance pulled away with lights and sirens blazing, heading toward the regional medical center 45 miles away. Jake watched it disappear into the night, wondering if he would ever know whether the woman survived, whether his actions had saved her life or simply prolonged her suffering. Deputy Santos continued taking her report, documenting every detail of Jake's decision to move the woman and transport her himself. She was thorough and professional, but Jake could see the conflict in her eyes. She had known him her entire life, had grown up knowing he was one of the most trustworthy people in the county. Writing him up for trying to save someone's life felt wrong, but the law was clear about civilian intervention in emergency situations. "I'm going to have to recommend charges," she said finally. "Reckless endangerment, possibly interfering with emergency services. It'll be up to the county attorney whether to prosecute, but I don't have a choice about making the report." Jake nodded again. He had known this was coming from the moment he decided to move the woman. "I understand, Maria. You're just doing your job. This isn't personal, Jake. You know that, right?" "I know." But, as Jake drove home that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. He had lived his entire life following rules, respecting authority, and trusting that the system worked for everyone. Now he was facing criminal charges for trying to save a life, and he wasn't sure what to think about the world anymore. Sarah was waiting up for him when he got home, having heard about the incident through the scanner she kept in the kitchen for monitoring fire department calls. Tommy was there too, looking worried and confused about why his father might be in trouble for helping someone. "Tell me what happened," Sarah said, and Jake recounted the entire evening, from finding the woman to his conversation with Deputy Santos. "So let me get this straight," Tommy said when his father finished. "You're going to be arrested for saving someone's life?" "It's more complicated than that, son. I broke rules about emergency medical care. There are good reasons for those rules. But she would have died if you hadn't helped her. Jake looked at his 16-year-old son, seeing the confusion and anger in his eyes. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't the same as doing the legal thing. I made a choice, and now I have to live with the consequences. Sarah took Jake's hand across the kitchen table. Do you regret it? Jake thought about the woman's pale face, her weak grip on his hand, the way she had tried to speak even though she was barely conscious. No. I don't regret it. I'd do it again. Over the next few days, word of the incident spread through Cedar Valley like wildfire. Jake Morrison, the respected rancher and volunteer firefighter, was facing criminal charges for trying to save a stranger's life. The story struck a nerve in the rural community, where self-reliance and helping neighbors were fundamental values. People began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why was there no cell phone coverage on Miller's Ridge Road when 3 families lived up there? Why did it take 45 minutes for an ambulance to reach accident victims in their area? Why was a man being punished for refusing to let someone die? The local newspaper picked up the story, then the regional papers, and, finally, the state news organizations. Jake Morrison became the reluctant center of a debate about emergency services in rural areas, about the conflict between following rules and saving lives, and about whether the system was failing the people it was supposed to protect. Meanwhile, Jake continued working his ranch and waiting to hear whether he would be formally charged with a crime. The woman he had saved, whose name he learned was Jennifer Walsh, remained in critical condition at the medical center. She was a 24-year-old graduate student from Colorado who had been driving through Wyoming on her way to visit family in Montana. Her car had skidded on the icy road and crashed into the tree, and, according to the doctors, she would have died from internal bleeding and shock if she hadn't received help when she did. Jake wanted to visit her in the hospital, to see for himself that she was recovering, but his lawyer advised against it. Any contact between them could complicate the criminal case, and Jake didn't want to do anything that might make his situation worse. But, late at night, lying in bed next to Sarah, Jake found himself thinking about Jennifer Walsh and wondering what her family was going through. He thought about the choice he had made on that dark road, and about the choice he would make again if faced with the same situation. He had no doubt that saving her life had been the right thing to do, regardless of what the law said about it. What Jake didn't know was that his story was reaching people far beyond Cedar Valley, Wyoming. Rural communities across the country were reading about his case and recognizing their own struggles with emergency response times and inadequate infrastructure. Emergency medical professionals were debating whether current protocols made sense in areas where help was hours away. Legal experts were questioning whether Good Samaritan laws provided adequate protection for people who acted to save lives in emergency situations. Jake Morrison's plea for speed on that October night was becoming something much bigger than one rancher's decision to break the rules. It was becoming a catalyst for change, a symbol of the conflict between human compassion and institutional bureaucracy, and a test case for how society balances public safety with individual responsibility. The question remained, would Jake Morrison be punished for his act of courage, or would his case inspire the kind of changes that could prevent other people from facing the same impossible choice? The answer would depend on what happened next, and on whether the system could evolve to match the values of the people it served. 2 weeks after the incident on Miller's Ridge Road, Jake Morrison received a call that would change everything. It was from Dr. Patricia Williams, the emergency department physician who had treated Jennifer Walsh at the regional medical center. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to personally thank you for what you did, Dr. Williams said. Jennifer Walsh is going to make a full recovery, and that's entirely because of your quick thinking and courage. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. For 2 weeks, he had been carrying the weight of not knowing whether Jennifer would survive, whether his decision to move her had ultimately helped or harmed her chances. How is she doing, doctor? She's awake, alert, and asking to meet you. She wants to thank you personally for saving her life. Jake's lawyer had advised him against any contact with Jennifer, but hearing that she was okay and wanted to see him made all the legal complications seem less important. I'd like that very much. There's something else you should know, Mr. Morrison. I've been practicing emergency medicine for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of cases where well-meaning civilians have made injuries worse by trying to help. But you did everything exactly right. Your first aid training from the fire department, your decision to move her when you did, even the way you transported her in your truck, it was all textbook emergency care. Dr. Williams paused, and Jake could hear her taking a deep breath before continuing. I've been following the news about the charges you're facing, and I want you to know that I'm going to be testifying on your behalf. What you did wasn't reckless endangerment. It was skilled emergency medicine performed under impossible circumstances by someone who refused to let a person die. That same afternoon, Jake received another unexpected call, this time from Robert Chen, the paramedic who had taken over Jennifer's care when the ambulance arrived. Jake, I've been thinking about what happened that night, and I need to tell you something. I've been a paramedic for 22 years, and I've responded to probably a dozen accidents on Miller's Ridge Road. Every single time, by the time we get there, it's too late. People die on that road because we can't reach them fast enough. Chen's voice was steady but emotional. You did what I would have done if I had been in your position. Hell, you did what I should have been doing all these years, advocating for better emergency coverage in rural areas instead of just accepting that some people are too far away to save. These conversations with the medical professionals gave Jake hope, but they also intensified the media attention surrounding his case. Dr. Williams' statement that Jake had performed skilled emergency medicine was picked up by news outlets across the country, turning his story from a simple case of rule-breaking into a complex debate about medical care, emergency response, and the rights and responsibilities of ordinary citizens in crisis situations. The attention brought unexpected allies. The Wyoming Cattlemen's Association issued a statement supporting Jake and calling for improved emergency services in rural areas. The volunteer fire departments from 3 counties published a joint letter praising Jake's training and quick thinking. Most surprisingly, the state chapter of the Emergency Medical Services Association broke with protocol and publicly stated that Jake's actions had been appropriate given the circumstances. But the legal system moved slowly, and Jake still faced potential criminal charges. County Attorney Mark Davidson was under pressure from both sides, law enforcement officials who insisted that civilians couldn't be allowed to take emergency response into their own hands, and public opinion that strongly supported Jake's actions. Davidson was a career prosecutor who had built his reputation on following the law strictly and consistently. He had prosecuted cases of reckless endangerment before, usually involving drunk drivers or people who had endangered others through careless or selfish behavior. Jake Morrison's case was different, but Davidson wasn't sure that good intentions were enough to excuse breaking the law. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Walsh had been following the news coverage of her rescue, and she was horrified to learn that her savior was facing criminal charges. Still recovering from her injuries but determined to help, she contacted a friend who worked for a national news network. 3 weeks after the accident, Jennifer Walsh appeared on national television to tell her story. She spoke about waking up in the hospital and learning that a stranger had risked everything to save her life. She described her gratitude, her amazement at Jake's skill and compassion, and her outrage that he was being punished for refusing to let her die. Jake Morrison is a hero, she said, looking directly into the camera with tears in her eyes. He saved my life when the system failed me. If he goes to prison for that, then the system is more broken than I thought. The interview was powerful, but what happened next was even more significant. Jennifer had done her research on emergency response times in rural Wyoming, and she presented statistics that were shocking even to people who worked in emergency services. The average response time for emergency medical services in Sweetwater County is 47 minutes, she said. In some areas, including Miller's Ridge Road, it can be over an hour. That means that anyone who has a heart attack, stroke, or serious accident in those areas will die before help arrives. Jake Morrison didn't break the law, he exposed a system that's been failing people for years. Jennifer's television appearance sparked a national conversation about rural emergency services. News outlets began investigating response times in rural areas across the country, and the statistics they found were alarming. Millions of Americans lived in areas where emergency help was more than 30 minutes away, far beyond the golden hour that medical professionals knew was critical for saving lives. Rural hospitals were closing due to funding shortages, volunteer emergency services were struggling with aging equipment and inadequate training, and cell phone coverage remained spotty in many remote areas. Jake Morrison's case became a symbol of these broader problems, and his legal troubles began to seem less like justice and more like scapegoating. The pressure on County Attorney Davidson intensified when he received a letter signed by 68 emergency medical professionals from across Wyoming. The letter stated that Jake Morrison had acted appropriately given the circumstances, that his actions had almost certainly saved Jennifer Walsh's life, and that prosecuting him would set a dangerous precedent that could discourage people from helping in future emergencies. But Davidson was also hearing from law enforcement officials who worried about the precedent Jake's case might set. If civilians were allowed to take emergency response into their own hands, where would it end? What if someone without Jake's training tried to help and made an injury worse? What if people started ignoring emergency protocols because they thought they knew better? Sheriff Tom Bradley, who supervised Deputy Santos, was particularly concerned about the message that dismissing charges against Jake might send. "I understand that Morrison had good intentions," Bradley said at a news conference. "But we can't have a society where everyone decides for themselves which laws to follow and which to ignore. Emergency response protocols exist for good reasons, and bypassing them, even with the best of intentions, puts everyone at risk." The debate split the community of Cedar Valley down the middle. People who had known Jake for years supported him without question, but others worried about the broader implications of his actions. The volunteer fire department found itself caught in the middle, with some members defending Jake's training and judgment while others argued that he should have followed proper procedures. Tommy Morrison struggled with the controversy surrounding his father. At school, most of his classmates thought his dad was a hero, but some of the teachers were more cautious in their comments. Tommy found himself defending his father's actions while also trying to understand the concerns that critics were raising. "I just don't get it," Tommy told his parents one evening. "Dad saved someone's life, and now people are arguing about whether that was okay?" Sarah Morrison had been Jake's strongest supporter throughout the ordeal, but she was also worried about the toll it was taking on their family. "Sometimes doing the right thing is complicated, honey. Your father made a choice that saved a life, but it also raised questions about how we handle emergencies in places like ours." The turning point came when Jennifer Walsh decided to visit Cedar Valley to meet Jake in person and to see the place where her accident had occurred. Her presence in the small Wyoming town brought national media attention, but it also provided a human face for the abstract legal and policy debates that had been swirling around Jake's case. Jennifer insisted on driving out to Miller's Ridge Road to see the accident site, accompanied by a news crew and several emergency response officials. Standing next to the damaged oak tree where her car had crashed, she tried to imagine what the scene had been like that night: the darkness, the isolation, the complete lack of communication or quick access to help. "When I think about Jake Morrison finding me here," she said, "I think about him having to choose between following rules and saving my life. I'm grateful every day that he chose my life." The visit to the accident site was eye-opening for the emergency response officials who accompanied Jennifer. They had responded to accidents on Miller's Ridge Road before, but standing there in daylight, with good weather and full communication capabilities, they were struck by how isolated and dangerous the location really was. Robert Chen, the paramedic who had taken over Jennifer's care, was particularly moved by the experience. "Looking at this place, understanding how long it would have taken us to reach her, I realized that Jake Morrison didn't just save her life, he showed us how broken our system really is." That evening, Jennifer met Jake Morrison for the first time since the night he had pulled her from her wrecked car. The meeting took place at the Morrison Ranch, with Sarah and Tommy present, and it was emotional for everyone involved. Jennifer was still recovering from her injuries, she walked with a slight limp and tired easily, but she was determined to express her gratitude in person. "I don't remember much about that night," she told Jake, "but I remember feeling your hand holding mine, and I remember you telling me everything would be okay. You kept that promise." Jake was overwhelmed by meeting the young woman whose life he had saved. Seeing her alive and recovering made all the legal troubles and media attention seem worthwhile. "I'm just glad you're okay," he said. "That's all that ever mattered to me." The meeting between Jake and Jennifer was covered by national news, and the image of the grateful young woman thanking her rescuer resonated with people across the country. Public opinion, which had already been largely supportive of Jake, became even more strongly in his favor. But, perhaps more importantly, Jennifer's visit to Cedar Valley and the accident site brought new urgency to discussions about rural emergency services. The stark reality of the response time and communication problems in areas like Miller's Ridge Road could no longer be ignored or dismissed as unavoidable challenges of rural living. Emergency services officials who had initially supported prosecuting Jake began to reconsider their positions. If the system was failing people in life or death situations, maybe the real crime was not Jake Morrison's decision to act outside protocol, but society's decision to accept inadequate emergency coverage for rural communities. County Attorney Davidson found himself under increasing pressure to drop the charges against Jake, but he was also aware that his decision would be watched by prosecutors, emergency officials, and rural communities across the country. Whatever he decided would set a precedent that could influence how similar cases were handled in the future. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, and Davidson knew that his choice would ultimately answer the question that had been at the heart of Jake Morrison's case from the beginning: when the system fails, are ordinary people justified in taking extraordinary actions to save lives? The answer would determine not just Jake's fate, but possibly the fate of countless other people who might face similar impossible choices in the future. County Attorney Mark Davidson hadn't slept well in weeks. The Jake Morrison case had taken over his life, his office, and his understanding of what justice really meant. Every morning brought new calls from reporters, emergency services officials, legal experts, and ordinary citizens who wanted to know when he would make his decision about whether to prosecute the rancher who had saved Jennifer Walsh's life. Davidson had built his career on clear-cut cases where the facts were obvious and the law was unambiguous. Drug dealers, drunk drivers, domestic violence perpetrators, these were people who had clearly broken the law and deserved to face consequences. Jake Morrison was different. By every legal definition, he had violated emergency medical protocols and could be charged with reckless endangerment. But, morally, ethically, and practically, his actions had been not just justified but heroic. The pressure was immense. Sheriff Bradley and several law enforcement organizations continued to argue that prosecuting Jake was necessary to maintain respect for emergency protocols. They pointed to statistics showing that civilian attempts at emergency medical care often made injuries worse, and they warned that excusing Jake's actions could encourage other untrained people to intervene in situations beyond their capabilities. But the weight of public opinion and expert testimony was overwhelmingly on Jake's side. Dr. Williams had submitted a detailed medical report explaining exactly how Jake's actions had saved Jennifer's life and demonstrating that his first aid training had prepared him to make the right decisions under pressure. Emergency services officials from rural areas across the country had written letters explaining how Jake's case highlighted the impossible situations faced by people living in remote areas with inadequate emergency coverage. Most significantly, Davidson had received a visit from Jennifer Walsh herself. Still recovering from her injuries but determined to speak on behalf of her rescuer, she had traveled back to Wyoming specifically to meet with the county attorney. "Mr. Davidson," she had said, sitting in his office with her crutches propped against the chair, "I understand that there are legal questions about what Jake Morrison did. But I need you to understand something: without his actions, I would be dead. Not injured, not disabled, but dead. How can that be a crime?" Davidson had explained the legal complexities, the need to maintain emergency protocols, the concerns about setting precedents that could encourage dangerous behavior by untrained civilians. Jennifer had listened politely, then asked a question that had haunted Davidson ever since. "If your daughter was dying in a car crash on Miller's Ridge Road, and Jake Morrison was the only person who could save her, would you want him to follow protocol and let her die, or would you want him to break the rules and bring her home alive?" The question cut to the heart of the matter in a way that all the legal briefs and expert opinions hadn't. Davidson had a 16-year-old daughter of his own, and he knew exactly what his answer would be. He would want Jake Morrison to save her, regardless of what the law said about proper procedures. But Davidson also understood that his decision would affect far more than just Jake Morrison's future. Rural communities across America were watching this case, and his choice would either validate their frustrations with inadequate emergency services or reinforce the authority of existing protocols that many felt were outdated and inappropriate for remote areas. The case had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The American Medical Association had issued a statement supporting Jake's actions and calling for emergency protocol reforms that would account for the realities of rural medical care. The National Association of Emergency Medical Technicians had published guidelines acknowledging that civilians with appropriate training should be allowed to provide emergency care when professional help was not available within a reasonable time frame. Even more surprisingly, the case had reached the Wyoming legislature, where representatives from rural districts were drafting what they called the Good Samaritan Protection Act, a law that would provide legal immunity for people who provided emergency medical care in situations where professional help was not readily available. State Representative Carol Jensen, who represented the district that included Cedar Valley, had become one of Jake's most vocal supporters. Jake Morrison's case shows us that our current laws are forcing people to choose between following the law and saving lives, she said during a legislative committee hearing. That's not a choice anyone should have to make. The proposed legislation would create specific protections for people who had received basic emergency medical training and who acted in good faith to help others when professional emergency services were not available. The bill included provisions for areas with limited cell phone coverage, long emergency response times, and inadequate medical facilities. But the legislation also faced opposition from medical professionals who worried that it could encourage unqualified people to provide dangerous medical care, and from law enforcement officials who believed it could undermine established emergency response protocols. Davidson found himself at the center of a debate that was much larger than one rancher's decision on a dark Wyoming road. His choice about whether to prosecute Jake Morrison would influence not just the proposed legislation, but similar laws in other states and the broader national conversation about emergency medical care in rural America. The media attention had brought both support and criticism. Jake Morrison had received thousands of letters and emails from people across the country who supported his actions, including many from rural residents who shared their own stories of inadequate emergency response times. But he had also received criticism from people who believed that civilians should never take emergency response into their own hands, regardless of the circumstances. The strain on the Morrison family had been enormous. Jake's volunteer fire department duties had been suspended pending the outcome of the case, depriving him of an activity that had been central to his identity for over a decade. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her school volunteer work to avoid putting the school district in an awkward position. Tommy had been approached by college recruiters who had seen the media coverage and were interested in the son of the hero rancher, but he was uncomfortable with the attention and unsure how to handle questions about his father's case. The community of Cedar Valley remained divided. Most longtime residents supported Jake without question, but newer residents and some business owners worried that the controversy was giving their town negative publicity. The annual Harvest Festival, scheduled for November, had been overshadowed by media attention and debates about the Morrison case. Pastor Michael Roberts of First Baptist Church, where the Morrison family attended services, had found himself counseling families on both sides of the debate. People are struggling with fundamental questions about right and wrong, about following rules versus following conscience, he explained. Jake's case has forced our entire community to examine what we really believe about helping others and respecting authority. The economic impact of the case had been unexpected but significant. Cedar Valley had seen an influx of reporters, legal experts, and curious visitors, providing a boost to local hotels and restaurants. But the attention had also attracted protesters from both sides of the debate, creating tension and requiring additional law enforcement presence. Jake Morrison himself remained focused on his ranch work and his family, trying to maintain normalcy while his case played out on a national stage. He had declined most interview requests and speaking opportunities, preferring to let others debate the broader implications of his actions. But the waiting was taking its toll. "I just want to know whether I'm going to prison," he told Sarah one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset over their pastures. "I can handle whatever consequences there are for what I did, but this uncertainty is killing me." Sarah had been Jake's rock throughout the ordeal, handling media requests, coordinating with lawyers, and maintaining the ranch's business operations while Jake dealt with the legal and emotional stress of the case. "You did the right thing," she reminded him. "Whatever happens next, you saved that girl's life, and that matters more than anything else." The legal process had been complicated by the national attention. Davidson had received advice and pressure from the state attorney general's office, federal officials, and legal experts from across the country. Some urged him to prosecute Jake as an example to others who might be tempted to take the law into their own hands. Others argued that prosecution would be a miscarriage of justice that would discourage people from helping others in emergency situations. Deputy Maria Santos, who had written the initial report on Jake's actions, had been struggling with her own role in the case. She had followed protocol by documenting Jake's violation of emergency medical procedures, but she had also seen the results of his actions, a young woman alive because someone had refused to follow rules that would have led to her death. "I keep thinking about what I would have done in Jake's position," Santos confided to Sheriff Bradley. "I like to think I would have followed procedure, but, honestly, I don't know if I could have watched someone die because I was afraid to break the rules." Sheriff Bradley understood his deputy's conflict, but he remained convinced that prosecuting Jake was necessary. "The moment we start making exceptions to the law based on good intentions, we lose the rule of law entirely," he argued. "Jake Morrison may have saved one life, but what about the next person who tries to help and makes things worse? What about the precedent we're setting?" The debate had reached emergency services departments across the country. Training programs were being revised to address scenarios like the one Jake had faced. Communication companies were being pressured to improve cell phone coverage in rural areas. Rural hospitals were using Jake's case to argue for increased funding and support. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had treated Jennifer Walsh, had become an unlikely advocate for emergency services reform. She had testified before legislative committees, spoken at medical conferences, and written articles about the need for new approaches to rural emergency care. "Jake Morrison's case isn't really about one man's decision to break protocol," she explained to a congressional subcommittee investigating rural healthcare. "It's about a system that puts people in impossible situations and, then, punishes them for refusing to accept unacceptable outcomes." The congressional hearing had brought national political attention to the case. Representatives from rural districts across the country had used Jake's story to highlight the challenges facing their constituents, while urban representatives had questioned whether changing emergency protocols would create more problems than it solved. As winter approached in Wyoming, Davidson knew he couldn't delay his decision much longer. The media attention was intensifying rather than fading, and public pressure for a resolution was mounting. Jake Morrison deserved to know whether he would face criminal charges, and the country was waiting to see whether the legal system would punish or protect someone who had acted to save a life. Davidson had consulted with prosecutors in other states who had faced similar cases, though none had attracted the same level of attention as Jake's. The consensus seemed to be that prosecution would be legally justified but practically and morally questionable. One prosecutor from Montana had put it bluntly, "You can probably convict him, but you'll destroy your career and set a precedent that will haunt emergency services for decades." The decision would ultimately come down to Davidson's personal judgment about what justice meant in this unprecedented case. Would prosecuting Jake Morrison serve the cause of justice, or would it punish a hero for refusing to let someone die? The answer would determine not just one rancher's fate, but the future of emergency response in rural America and the balance between following rules and saving lives. Time was running out for Mark Davidson to make the most important decision of his prosecutorial career, knowing that whatever choice he made would echo through courtrooms, emergency services departments, and rural communities across the nation for years to come. On a cold December morning, exactly 8 weeks after Jake Morrison had made his fateful decision on Miller's Ridge Road, County Attorney Mark Davidson called a press conference that would bring national attention to the small courthouse in Cedar Valley, Wyoming. News vans lined the main street, reporters crowded the courthouse steps, and citizens from across the county gathered to hear the decision that would determine Jake Morrison's fate and potentially reshape emergency response protocols across rural America. Jake Morrison sat in the front row of the courthouse, flanked by his wife Sarah and their son Tommy. His weathered hands were folded calmly in his lap, but the tension in his shoulders revealed the strain of 2 months of uncertainty. Behind him sat Jennifer Walsh, who had insisted on being present for the announcement despite her ongoing recovery from the accident. She had flown in from Colorado with her parents, determined to support the man who had saved her life. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathered outside listening to speakers that had been hastily installed. Sheriff Tom Bradley sat near the back, his expression unreadable. Deputy Maria Santos, who had filed the original report, was visibly nervous as she waited to hear whether her documentation would lead to criminal charges against a man she had known and respected her entire life. Davidson approached the podium with a thick folder of documents, legal briefs, medical reports, and expert testimony that had accumulated over the past 2 months. He had spent sleepless nights reviewing every aspect of the case, consulting with legal experts, medical professionals, and rural emergency services officials from across the country. The decision he was about to announce would be the most significant of his career. "Ladies and gentlemen," Davidson began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courthouse, "I have reviewed all aspects of the case involving Mr. Jake Morrison and the events that occurred on October 23 on Millers Ridge Road. This review has included extensive consultation with emergency medical professionals, legal experts, and officials from rural communities across the United States." Davidson paused, looking directly at Jake Morrison before continuing. "The facts of this case are not in dispute. Mr. Morrison discovered an injured person trapped in a vehicle, assessed that waiting for emergency services would likely result in her death, and made the decision to extract and transport her himself, despite lacking formal medical credentials and contrary to established emergency response protocols." The tension in the courthouse was palpable. Jake Morrison's supporters held their breath, while law enforcement officials waited to see whether protocols would be upheld or abandoned. Under strict interpretation of Wyoming emergency response statutes, Mr. Morrison's actions could be considered reckless endangerment, Davidson continued. However, the law must be applied with wisdom, taking into account not just the letter of legal requirements but the spirit of justice and the preservation of human life. Davidson's voice grew stronger as he reached the heart of his decision. "After extensive review and consultation, I have determined that no criminal charges will be filed against Jake Morrison. His actions, while technically outside established protocols, were reasonable, necessary, and ultimately life-saving under the specific circumstances he faced." The courthouse erupted in applause and cheers, with many people wiping away tears of relief and joy. Jake Morrison closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of 2 months of uncertainty lift from his shoulders. Sarah Morrison grabbed her husband's hand, while Tommy Morrison smiled broadly for the first time in weeks. But Davidson wasn't finished. He raised his hand for quiet and continued with the most important part of his announcement. "However, this case has revealed critical flaws in our emergency response systems that must be addressed immediately. Mr. Morrison should never have been placed in a position where he had to choose between following protocol and saving a life. The fact that such situations exist represents a failure of our emergency services infrastructure that demands urgent attention." Davidson then outlined a comprehensive plan that had emerged from discussions with state officials, emergency services leaders, and rural community representatives. The plan included immediate improvements to cell phone coverage on rural roads, additional emergency medical equipment for volunteer fire departments, and revised training programs that would qualify rural residents to provide advanced first aid in situations where professional help was not immediately available. Furthermore, Davidson announced, "I am joining with emergency services officials and rural legislators to support the Good Samaritan Protection Act currently before the Wyoming legislature. This law will provide legal protection for trained individuals who provide emergency medical care when professional services are not readily available." The announcement was more than anyone had expected. Not only were charges being dropped, but Jake's case was becoming the catalyst for systematic improvements to rural emergency services. Jennifer Walsh wiped tears from her eyes as she realized that her near-death experience was leading to changes that could save countless other lives. Sheriff Bradley approached Davidson after the press conference, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "I still have concerns about the precedent this sets," he said, "but I understand your reasoning. Maybe it's time we focus less on protecting protocols and more on protecting people." Deputy Maria Santos felt a mixture of relief and vindication. "I'm glad I documented everything accurately," she said later. "It allowed everyone to see exactly what Jake faced that night and why his actions were justified." The media response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Editorial boards across the country praised Davidson's decision and called for similar reforms to emergency services in rural areas. The story became a symbol of common sense prevailing over bureaucratic inflexibility, and Jake Morrison was hailed as a hero who had exposed critical flaws in emergency response systems. But perhaps the most significant impact was on emergency services policies across the country. Within 6 months of Davidson's announcement, 12 states had passed variations of the Good Samaritan Protection Act, providing legal immunity for trained civilians who provided emergency care when professional help was not available. Rural fire departments received increased funding for equipment and training. Cell phone companies accelerated their rural coverage expansion programs. The American Medical Association revised its guidelines for emergency care in remote areas, acknowledging that situations might arise where trained civilians should be allowed and encouraged to provide life-saving care. Emergency medical technician training programs began including modules on working with civilian responders and recognizing when protocol flexibility might be necessary. Jake Morrison returned to his ranch and his quiet life, but he was forever changed by the experience. He continued serving with the volunteer fire department, which had not only reinstated him but had also appointed him to head their new rural emergency response training program. He began speaking at emergency services conferences across the country, sharing his experience and advocating for improved rural emergency coverage. "I never wanted to be famous," Jake said at one such conference. "I just wanted to save a life. But if my experience helps other communities improve their emergency services, then something good came out of a terrible situation." Jennifer Walsh made a full recovery from her injuries and completed her graduate studies in environmental science. She became an advocate for rural emergency services reform, working with state and federal agencies to identify underserved areas and develop solutions for improving response times and coverage. She and Jake Morrison developed a close friendship, bonded by the night that had changed both their lives. "Jake gave me my future back," Jennifer said during a congressional hearing on rural healthcare. But, more than that, his courage started a conversation that needed to happen about how we protect and serve people who live in rural communities. The Morrison family found that their ordeal had brought them closer together. Tommy Morrison decided to study emergency medical services in college, inspired by his father's example and determined to continue improving emergency care in rural areas. Sarah Morrison became active in rural healthcare advocacy, using her experience to help other families navigate medical emergencies. "We learned that sometimes doing the right thing is more important than following rules," Sarah reflected. "But we also learned that when good people are forced to choose between rules and lives, it's the system that needs to change, not the people." The changes that resulted from Jake Morrison's case extended far beyond Wyoming. Rural communities across America began demanding better emergency services. Federal programs were established to improve communication infrastructure in remote areas. Medical schools began requiring training in rural emergency care for all students. 5 years after the incident on Miller's Ridge Road, response times for emergency medical services in rural Wyoming had improved by an average of 18 minutes. 3 new emergency medical stations had been established in previously underserved areas. Cell phone coverage had been expanded to include all major rural roads. Most importantly, no one else had faced the impossible choice that Jake Morrison had confronted that October night. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had treated Jennifer Walsh and testified on Jake's behalf, was appointed to head a new federal task force on rural emergency services. "Jake Morrison's case taught us that heroism isn't just about individual courage," she said. "It's about having the wisdom to learn from crisis and the determination to make sure it doesn't happen again." The oak tree on Miller's Ridge Road where Jennifer Walsh's car had crashed became an unofficial memorial to the power of individual action to create systematic change. Someone had placed a small plaque at its base that simply read, "Sometimes saving one life changes everything." Jake Morrison's plea for speed on that dark October night had indeed shocked everyone, but not for the reasons anyone expected. It wasn't the breaking of rules that was shocking, it was the system that had made breaking rules necessary. The real shock was discovering how many communities were one accident away from tragedy, how many people lived beyond the reach of timely help, and how quickly things could change when someone refused to accept that as inevitable. The rancher who had never broken a rule in his life had broken the most important rule of all, the rule that said some people were too far away to save. In doing so, he had proven that distance, protocol, and bureaucracy were no match for human compassion, practical skill, and the simple refusal to let someone die when you had the power to save them. Jake Morrison's legacy wasn't just saving Jennifer Walsh's life, though that would have been enough. His legacy was proving that ordinary people could create extraordinary change, that individual acts of courage could reshape entire systems, and that sometimes the most powerful plea for speed is the decision to act before it's too late. The cowboy tale that began with a desperate phone call on a lonely Wyoming road had become something much larger, a story about the power of conscience over protocol, the importance of questioning systems that fail the people they're supposed to protect, and the endless capacity of human beings to care for each other when it matters most. In the end, Jake Morrison's action had indeed shocked everyone, because it reminded them what was possible when someone decided that saving a life was worth any consequence, and when a community decided that such choices should never have to be made again.